Lord Willetts, and welcome him to today's conference. Lord Willetts is the Executive Chair of the Resolution Foundation and served as an MP in the UK between 1992 and 2015. He was the Minister for Universities and Science between 2010 and 2014, and as many of you will know, during that time he was instrumental in securing a very significant increase in investment in HPC and the infrastructure in the UK, including the Dirac HPC facility. He's a board member of UKRI, the UK Research and Innovation, the body that brings together all the research councils in the UK, and is also Chancellor of the University of Leicester, which is where we are today. I know that Lord Willetts has very broad interests in terms of science in general, and also in the fundamental role that HPC and AI and the infrastructure play in terms of delivering the research that we all want to do. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing his comments and having an interesting discussion afterwards. So would you please welcome Lord Willetts.
Very good. I can do that. Right. Okay. Good. Well, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for the invitation to join you, and I'm grateful to Mark for setting this up and inviting me along. I mean, I should thank you for the invitation, but equally in a way I should welcome you here, because one reason why I was very pleased to accept the invitation was as the Chancellor of the University of Leicester, I'm keen for the University of Leicester to be at the forefront of these kind of debates. And of course at Leicester we're very proud that we are one of the 4 sites for Dirac, along with Edinburgh and Durham and Cambridge. So Leicester has its own position in high-performance computing. So I'm partly here wearing my hat as Chancellor of the University of Leicester. As you heard, I am on the board of UKRI, so to some extent I'm wearing my UKRI hat, but nothing I say necessarily commits UKRI, unfortunately. Well, not yet. So it doesn't necessarily represent that we haven't, at the board of UKRI, we've not yet had a considered discussion of these issues. So I'm here speaking in a personal capacity. And then, of course, also, as you heard from Mark, I'm here thinking back to my time as Science Minister. And I'm proud of the fact that then we did drive investment in e-infrastructure. And we did have we had a plan, we had an e-infrastructure roadmap. I created and co-chaired an e-infrastructure leadership council. And I even did get £145 million from the Treasury spent on various aspects of e-infrastructure, including Archer, but also at Hartree and elsewhere. But after that, it all fizzled out. And there have been some investments, but I am very aware that HPC has had very little investment and funding for the last few years. So looking back on my experience, there's a painful lesson to be learned that the surge was not sustained. And the question is how this time round we can ensure that it's different. How this time round it's not a once-off injection. We have a sustained commitment that carries on regardless of changes in politics or ministerial personnel. That, I think, is, for me, looking at it as a policymaker, the challenge now. And I do think that so far we've made an excellent start. I think that the white papers that are circulating in draft about high-performance computing really do set out an intellectual framework very well. I think events like this help. It's particularly important to hear the links between the scientific and the business application. Fascinating presentation on Rolls-Royce. And you are also trying to tackle some of the deep conceptual issues issues that certainly stretch me, like the links and contrasts between high-performance computing and AI. So you're doing all the right things, but now there is still a lot more to do. For me, this all begins with the core simple case that big data and the powerful computing you need in order to analyze very large data sets is at the heart of modern science. It's a crucial driver of the modern economy, and it also helps us understand our own society. And it is very hard now to do serious, ambitious research or to be running a major business prime without in some way using the power of large-scale computing. I still think back, and this is a generation or two back, this is when I was the minister years ago, I think back to going to open a wind tunnel that we'd funded, I think at Imperial. And we were discussing this wind tunnel, and a rather old-fashioned way of thinking of it was just to enable users like Rolls-Royce design better planes on the basis of the empirical evidence as the wind tunnel operated. But the scientists were excited because they said turbulence was one of the unresolved issues in classical physics and classical mechanics, which they wanted to do more work on. And then the computer people were excited because for them it was a big data project. They're going to get more data from the sensors than they had before, and it's going to challenge them to analyze that effectively. And for me, that was just an example how practical business use, an interesting conceptual issue in science, and also the power of big data and the need to have sophisticated software to extract value from the hardware, that all came together. But the evidence is that the UK is falling behind, and we need to do far more. Now, I am fundamentally an optimist. And in many ways, I do think after several years when you have been trying to operate with insufficient investment, we've now got the right combination of factors. We've got a clear need expressed in the documents produced by this community. We also got last week a very significant statement from the Chancellor recommitting the new government under Boris Johnson to the target of British R&D spend getting to 2.4% of GDP, which is about the OECD average, but we lag behind it. We're stuck on about 1.7% of GDP, and there's a commitment to get there by 2027. And that is an unusual target because it's a combination of public spend and private spend. And one thing we are looking at very intensely at UKRI is designing the public spend in the right way to try to leverage in private spend a long time, to crowd in private spend. But you've done the analytical work. We've now got a commitment on increased public and private expenditure, and there's powerful advocacy beginning. So what could possibly go wrong, as the pollsters told David Cameron before he called the referendum? What could go wrong? Well, nothing is guaranteed, so various things could go wrong. And what I'd now like to do is to just identify a set of questions, issues, queries, which I think a lay person engaging with your agenda is going to ask. Now, I realise that many of them you will have, for every one of these, someone in this room will already have written something or engaged with it in some way. I'm not saying these are novel, but I think that I offer it as a kind of shopping list of issues that you need to show that you've tackled in order for your request for, let's face it, really rather substantial amounts of public money. People are talking about £2 billion over 5 years for really rather substantial amounts of public money to be allocated to HPC. So first of all, which is in a way the theme of this conference, a lot of us in the lay world are not totally clear about HPC as distinct from AI. And we are, if anything, AI has had all the attention in the last few years, and we're used to the idea that lots of GPUs developed for another purpose are key to doing successful AI. Winning the more classical argument for HPC, that not necessarily so based on GPUs, and it is more than simply the aggregate of lots of powerful computing power. That still needs to be explained to the layman. And the more that you can create an alliance between HPC and AI, the more you can show convergence, which I understand is one of the themes of this conference, that's better. So that will strengthen your hand. So first of all, what exactly is the difference between HPC and AI, and how does is there overlap and convergence? Is there a future where these things come together, or are your requirements always going to be fundamentally different from AI requirements? I think getting all that clear in our head in a straightforward way, that people, for example, in the Treasury, who are smart but not necessarily familiar with the way that technology is developing, I think that's very important. First point. Second point is the balance of hardware and software. And something that, when I look at the UK's comparative advantage in science and technology, one of the arguments I used to deploy is that paradoxically one of our strengths was we didn't always have the raw firepower of the Americans, as a result of which we had to be smarter. We didn't have the world's biggest, most powerful computers, so we had to write better code to get a result with fewer calculations. We almost reached a stage where we regarded the competition to have one of the world's most powerful computers as a rather vulgar thing, not very English. We were much too smart to need to just have very, very powerful kit. That was the brash American approach to computing. So what is the balance between the need for very powerful computing and the value of smart software that extracts the most value from any given strength of system? I remember going to open the system up in Edinburgh, and that, even when we opened it, was I think not in the sort of top 25 of computers, but we were very proud of the fact that because it was going to have very sophisticated software, it was going to be very energy efficient. It was going to use less energy to reach a result for any given problem than some other systems. So what's the balance between hardware and software is the second question. Now the third thing, and you will be exasperated by this one, but I tell you, I was having a conversation with a senior person in the Treasury, one of the Chancellor's advisors, before coming up here, just kind of sensing what the mood was on all this type of stuff. And he said to me, why can't we just buy what we need off the cloud? Why can't we just, what's the case for build as distinct from pay for access? Why do we need to build all this? And if you think of the way in which lots of public policy is done, by and large, the shift has been away from owning stuff towards contracting for the delivery of services. And when you look at the extraordinary surge in cloud services from Amazon and Microsoft or whatever, there will be some fairly well-informed people who say, well, why don't we just use them? So explaining why this is an area where we can't simply use cloud-based services from very large American corporates, and we actually need to procure, buy, and operate our own systems is another argument that you need to set out. And then fourthly, have we got the capacity to manage these things well? Now, it's not just a matter of buying them, and here there's an upside and there's a downside. There's an upside that when you buy it and procure it, you actually end up having to engage much more closely with how it works and understand it than if you're simply the passive purchaser of a service. On the other hand, we have certainly on the AI side a mixed reputation. There was the big machine learning. There was the deadline recently for the big machine learning conference, the NIPS conference, and I'm told by machine learning practitioners in the UK that the JADE system could not handle the volume of activity as people were all trying to complete their papers by the deadline, and there were hours when JADE completely froze. And so I pick up from the community a bit of grumbling about JADE. Are we confident that we can actually make these things work? Have we got the management capacity and the management expertise? And I know this is an unfair point to make, but in a way, as we haven't had a big investment in high-performance computing for several years. That raises more legitimately the question, if there's a really big surge in spending and we suddenly move upscale to really big kit, are we sure we're going to be able to operate it well? And the kind of boom-bust cycle in science infrastructure and science spend itself can lead to inefficiency and waste. So are we confident that we can actually run all this new kit well? That was my fourth point. Then next on my list was, how are we going to invest in the skills alongside the kit? And I think in a way that's one of the arguments for a proper plan and a plan you stick with. And it was a point that I'm very aware of, that we do need to invest in skills alongside. But, and I think Mark was saying this to me in a previous conversation, if we have a plan, we may get more skills, but at what level do we need these skills? Is there a proper sense of the human capital investment that's required? Is it all doctoral students and centres for doctoral training? Have we got the data scientists who are going to be able to curate the data that these very large computer systems are going to be handling and generating? And on some measures, the biggest single constraint, and again, I can just imagine the beady-eyed skeptic in the Treasury saying this, saying, nice idea, but I don't think the UK has actually got the capacity and the skills to operate all these systems. So have we got a credible plan for generating these skills? And to what extent can you imagine people converting, people who may be working in a different branch of science, people who've got an undergraduate degree, then doing a master's that enables them to move into data science or advanced computing? Have we got a plan for all that alongside the procurement plan for buying the kit? Now, sorry, I don't want to depress you, I'm halfway through. Yeah. I've got 10 questions, I'm halfway through. And I'm sure you can answer them all, but I just want to carry on recording them. But we're halfway through, and then you can tell me what all the answers are. And you might even share with me the really difficult questions that I'm not aware of, you're going to have to tell. So next, as I say, the 2.4% is a public and private spend combination. And in my experience, one of the best ways of winning arguments with the Treasury is co-investment. They love evidence of leverage, and in the original arguments with them on Archer and other stuff, it was partnerships with IBM, it was evidence from business users. But there's several different forms of co-investment. One form of co-investment, which I did see very clearly set out in the draft white papers, is with the manufacturers, suppliers in the chain for HPC. Clearly the IBMs of this world or whatever will do us a good deal, and there will be the opportunity to work with IBM, and you can imagine a negotiation where clearly there are conversations going on at the moment about, I think they're reorganizing their research effort at the moment, and obviously we want to have 2 IBM research centers in the new structure, Hursley and Daresbury. Well, what kind of deals do we get with the businesses actually providing the stuff? So that's my 6th question. Are we doing a smart negotiation where we get some things that we want from these people? But there's a different question. My 7th question is kind of, what is the wider business case? And that's why I did find the account of Rolls-Royce's use of, the way that the use of high-performance computing has contributed to the development of the Trent engine absolutely fascinating. And we do need a lot of that. And when we looked at it before in the 2012 bidding process, there were 3 or 4 sectors that I had got very much in mind, drawing on expert advice, of course. Aerospace and automotive, health and pharma, the voice of a company like GSK, AstraZeneca, very important. The wider bioeconomy, so I should declare another interest. I chair the Sanger Institute, and the genomics revolution is incredibly exciting, and there's a large amount of effort going into genomics. And so someone like Professor John Bell at Oxford, who is the government's lead advisor on genomics and the life sciences revolution, and who is very well connected with government, if he's an advocate of this and says this is investment that we need to carry forward the life sciences strategy, which has already been endorsed and accepted by ministers, that certainly helps. And then, of course, the digital media community, the wider creative industries and industries like gaming. And the more that they are advocates and explain how this will help them, the more powerful the case will be. But they in turn need to understand what the value is of HPC, which may well bring capabilities of which they're currently unaware and for which their business is not currently prepared. As, again, a comment I remember from years ago, which may still be relevant because not every business is quite as far-sighted as Rolls-Royce. Someone said, businesses don't just say, build me a virtual prototype. They need to have the understanding that people can do that for them, and this is relevant for their business and how they try to operate it. In other words, there's a selling business to create demand for this. We can't just assume that already the GSKs of this world are on side. The more that it is explained to them how this capacity could in turn enable them to do things for their business which they are not currently able to do and hadn't thought of, that's really important. And then the strapline for that is things like delivering growth through modelling and simulation. And as soon as you're talking about this contributing to the growth of the British economy, it's really useful. The co-chair of my e-infrastructure council, when I said that, was Dominic Tilsley of Unilever. And he had fantastic practical examples of how, and I think Unilever appears in some of the draft white papers again today, but he'd say how things like when they create a new detergent or a new shampoo, they have literally to leave it in the warehouse for 6 months to find out what condition it will be in if there's a warehouse or a shop that's stocking it for 6 months. Being able to model the decay of the fluids in a new detergent so you don't have to literally wait 6 months before you put it in the shop was a massive business gain for them. So the more there are practical business examples, and we work with the business community to promote those. So that's another example. Then behind these business links, there's first of all the providers, the big companies actually making the kit, the stuff. Secondly, the key business primes in the UK that have got the strategic capability to use this. Third, and I think in some ways most significant, because it's the big weakness of the UK, is behind them, it's the SME sector. And I tell you, in my time, and I believe this still goes on, one of the issues we used to have was that Rolls-Royce or Jaguar Land Rover or whatever, or Nissan, would say to us, okay, they're using the latest in computer-aided design, they've got powerful computer systems, but they've got 3,000 SMEs dotted across the UK, half of whom have absolutely no capacity to work with high-performance computing and advanced e-infrastructure, and they would shift increasingly activities abroad unless the capacities of their own supply chain was increased. And although they would do some of that, they're willing to put their hands in their pockets and do some stuff, they really wanted a partnership with government in raising the capacities of their supply chain. And Hartree has been very important in all this, something that enables a people who are maybe producing a small component for Rolls-Royce from a relatively small engineering company somewhere in the Midlands and the North, for whom some of that stuff would have looked pretty scary, to have the opportunity of a taster, having the opportunity of accessing some of this very sophisticated kit and trying to use it and see what it means for them. And I think that the spreading it out to the SMEs and making it accessible, what we used to call on-ramps, where they could, for the first time, find themselves dealing with computing systems rather more powerful than the ones they're ever going to be able to afford to buy for themselves for their own company, that is really important. And reaching out to those type of businesses is a challenge, but we have got some networks. The Catapult Centres, for example, centres of co-funded R&D spend, bringing together public and private sectors, lobby the chief executives of our network of catapults as to why investing in high-performance computing and perhaps AI can help them, and in turn the industries that they work with. The high-value manufacturing catapult is probably the biggest one of the lot, with the widest network of contacts. If they're an advocate and an ally saying this will help us raise the performance of the companies we deal with, that will be very useful. So cultivate the links to the SMEs. So that was the 8th one on my list. Then there's two more. The 9th one, and I'm reminded a bit of someone's account of definition of the character of Oxford. He heard two elderly gentlemen walking around a quad in conversation, and one was saying to the other, "And ninthly." So I'm now on to my "and ninthly" item, and that, I'm afraid, is Brexit and the EU. How all this fits into Brexit, and what view we take of praise and the future of praise. In my day, and I think these tensions carry on, in my day the tension was whether the praise was to operate on a more British philosophy that you procure the best system you can find anywhere in the world, and to what extent it operated on a slightly more continental corporatist philosophy. It's supposed to be growing domestic capability in individual countries and spending money on computers made in those countries. I think that tension carries on in praise, so there'll be people here who are much closer to it than I am. What kind of links we want and expect to have with Europe if Brexit has happened. In the worst case scenario, presumably we'll have to work on the basis that the praise capabilities across Europe may not be accessible to us. Of course, we procure them. We might even find that we get less favourable terms, or it's harder for us to buy the time on European computers. So, dare I say it, I'm a shameless old Remainer myself, but now we've got a Brexit government. The message that now Britain has to sort of stand on its own and needs to invest in some of its own capacity because it can't any longer rely simply on access to capabilities on the continent, and we may not be in praise anymore. I think that's an argument that might have some purchase with some ministers. I don't like it, but I think that's the environment. And then finally, so 10th on my list, is bring all this to life with real live examples. Of course, you've got some fantastic examples from the furthest reaches of scientific research, and you've also got examples from big business. But there may be homely examples, or examples that link directly to the experiences of constituents, MPs, media, lay people. I used in 2012, for example, the fact that British Cycling said that in preparing for the Olympics, their access to sophisticated computer modelling, as they tried to model exactly what was the right design of helmet or whatever, but there was a lovely kind of thank you message from the head of British Cycling about how important access to computer modelling had been for the performance of the British cycling team. It's things like that which you can deploy to win hearts and minds way beyond the ambitions you have in cosmology or whatever. Disasters and disaster relief. Think of how climate change is now threatening us with trying to understand what happens if forests are drier, if temperatures are higher. I remember we'd had some bad floods one summer, and although we got the Met Office able to model the weather on top, we had incredibly primitive systems for understanding how literally damp, soggy, how much water there was in the soil, and therefore whether when all this rain fell it was going to be absorbed in the soil or was going to run off. So we'd invested a large amount in Met Office modelling, but none in really hydrographic modelling of what happens if the rain falls day after day and the absorptive capacity of the land is reduced. That's the point at which you get more flooding. So anything that turns this power of modelling into tackling human problems that our fellow citizens engage with and understand, and which politicians have to engage with understand. And as I say, I don't say that list is 10 things that won't have occurred to you guys. I can sense already in the work you're doing, you're very aware of them. But if as a result of events like this conference, people are clear in their own heads how to tackle those type of challenges, then absolutely we can look forward to a transformation in the amount of investment in e-infrastructure, high performance computing and AI in the UK. Thank you very much indeed.